Strathnaver, in Sutherland, on the 13th of June, 1814. The estate factor is clearing the township. During the eviction of a crofter named William Chisholm, the roof of the house is set on fire, with Chisholm's mother-in-law, Margaret Mackay, still inside. She is pulled out by her daughter, carried to a nearby shed, and dies 5 days later. The factor's name is Patrick Seller. He is tried at Inverness for culpable homicide and arson, and acquitted at 1:15 in the morning on the 24th of April, 1816. He then stays on the Sutherland estate as a tenant sheep farmer, becomes highly successful, and ends up one of the largest landowners in the district he had cleared. And the reason all of it happened is not cruelty, and it is not conquest, and it is not religion. The reason is that a Cheviot sheep pays more rent than a family does. That is the entire story, and everything else is detail. But the interesting question is not why sheep were more profitable. Sheep were always more profitable per acre than subsistence farmers. The interesting question is why that fact suddenly started to matter around 1790, when it had been equally true for 400 years before. The answer is that the people on the land had stopped being an asset and become a cost, and that reclassification happened in London, on paper, in the space of about 3 years. So let's take a Highland estate apart properly. What it was, what it earned, what changed, and why the men who carried out the clearances were in many cases the direct descendants of the men whose entire claim to authority had been the protection of those same families. And nobody teaches you this. You can go through 12 years of school with a picture of Highland history as a story of romance and defeat, and never encounter the fact that the clearances were, in the plainest sense, a corporate restructuring, driven by debt, executed by professional estate managers, and justified in the language of improvement. The rentals survive. The estate correspondence survives. The trial records survive. So let's follow the money. Start with what a chief actually owned before any of this, because it is not what you would guess. The clan was the major social unit of the Highlands, headed by a chief, with members of his family holding positions of authority beneath him. And the relationship between that chief and the people on his land was governed by a Gaelic concept called Dúchas. Dúchas held that the chief had a duty to protect the people of the clan within the physical boundaries of the clan lands, and that in return, they owed him military service and allegiance. Read that as a contract, because that is what it functioned as. It is a mutual obligation. Land in exchange for men. Protection in exchange for service. And crucially, it is not written down anywhere as a lease. It is customary. It has the force of centuries of practice, and no force at all in a court of law, and that distinction will eventually decide everything. So what was a chief's wealth? It was not rent. Tenant farmers on that terrain scratched a living off rugged ground and paid only small rents. And the consequence is one historians state directly. These were chiefs whose wealth did not match that of their lowland contemporaries. His wealth was men. The number of fighting men he could raise was his standing, his security, and his political weight. A chief with 1,000 men who could be called out was a significant figure regardless of what his rent roll said. Which means the population on his land was not a cost. It was the product. Every family on the estate was a unit of the only asset that counted. Now hold that against the modern instinct, which is that a landlord wants high rent and few tenants. In this system, the opposite was true. You wanted people. Subdividing holdings so more families could live on the same ground was not a failure of estate management. It was the point. And then, in one battle and its legal aftermath, that asset was destroyed by statute. In 1746, the clan army was broken at Culloden, and what followed mattered far more than the battle. The government dismantled the legal structure of the clan system. Heritable jurisdictions, the chief's private right to hold courts and dispense justice over his own people, were abolished. The wearing of arms was banned. The chief's power to summon men into the field was removed, permanently, by law. Now think about what that does to the balance sheet. The chief still holds the land. He still has the same number of families on it, but the thing those families produced, armed men, and the authority that came with commanding them, has been abolished by Act of Parliament. It cannot be sold, converted, or restored. Overnight, the population on his estate stopped being an asset, and became what it had always been in strict cash terms. Several thousand people occupying land, paying very small rents, consuming its output. That is the reclassification. Nobody announced it. Nobody wrote it down as a policy. It simply followed from the fact that a chief who cannot raise men is not a chief. He is a landowner. And that is exactly how the historians described the shift. Clan chiefs started to see themselves as landowners, not just leaders of their people. I should be precise about the timing, though, because the neat version of this story is slightly too neat. Many Highland chiefs had already begun considering themselves lairds before Culloden, with some having removed themselves to society life in lowland cities and even to England. The first clearance on the Isle of Skye occurred in the 1730s, before the battle. Culloden did not create the process. It removed the last legal reason to resist it. And what accelerated it was money. Specifically, the money the chiefs began to spend once they were absorbed into British society. Their absentee lifestyles required money. Land and titles alone could not buy an Edinburgh townhouse, or a southern education for their children, or a place in a social world that now measured them against English and lowland landowners rather than against other chiefs. So the cost base rose while the revenue base, small rents from subsistence tenants, did not. And an owner with a rising cost base and a static income has exactly one lever available: raise the rent. But you cannot raise the rent on a subsistence farmer who has no cash. He is not holding back money. He does not have it. His holding produces enough to feed his family and a small surplus, and that surplus is the rent. So if you want more money out of the same acres, you cannot get it from the people on them. You have to change what the acres do. And there is a second reason the tenants could not simply pay more, which explains why the whole system was so brittle. The old Highland farming arrangement was communal. Townships held land in runrig, strips of arable ground periodically redistributed among the families, with the surrounding hill grazed in common. It supported a lot of people at a low standard of living, and it was reasonably good at that, which was the point when people were the product. But it was poor at producing a surplus for sale. Nobody in that system had much incentive to improve a strip they might not hold next year, and no individual family controlled enough ground to do anything ambitious with it. Historians describe it plainly: over-subdivided holdings that supported a growing population but yielded low productivity. So when the landlord looked at his estate and asked where the money was, he was not looking at lazy tenants. He was looking at a system deliberately optimized for headcount rather than output, in a world that had just stopped paying for headcount. Which brings us to the ruling number of this entire business, and it is brutally simple. Rent per acre under sheep versus rent per acre under people. That is the whole calculation, and it is not close. A single sheep farmer, usually a lowland or border man with capital, experience, and access to markets, could lease a very large area and pay a rent per acre that no township of small tenants could approach. He brings capital. He brings a hardy commercial breed. He sells wool into a market that, during the Napoleonic Wars, was booming. The Cheviot was the instrument. A hardy breed that could survive Highland winters on the same inland glens the townships farmed. And we can name the man who brought it. In 1791, Sir John Sinclair of Ulster imported Cheviot ewes from the Northumberland and Borders country into Caithness and Sutherland, where they became the basis of the North Country Cheviot. Now, Sinclair is worth pausing on, because he complicates the easy version of this story. He was not a speculator. He was the first president of the Board of Agriculture, and the man who initiated the statistical account of Scotland, the great survey of the country, parish by parish. He is, in fact, the first person recorded using the word statistics in English. From the mid-1780s, he devoted himself, in the phrasing of the parliamentary record, to the promotion of improvement, and he put his ideas into practice on his own estates, and his political career ended amid financial difficulties and public ridicule. Sit with that. The most systematic improver of his generation, a man who invented a word we still use, who surveyed his entire country, and who introduced the animal that emptied the Highlands, did not personally end up rich. Which tells you something important. This was not a conspiracy of clever men enriching themselves. It was a general movement, entered into by people of very different motives and competences, most of whom believed they were modernizing a backward economy. Some of them were ruined by it too. Before we go further, I want to be careful about something, because this period is genuinely contested. There is a version of this story in which the landlords are simply monsters, and a version in which they are rational managers responding to market signals, and a version in which they are indebted men doing what their creditors required. All three have evidence behind them, and serious historians disagree about the weight of each. What is not in dispute is the mechanism, the rentals, the evictions, the sheep, and that is what this episode is built on, where I describe motive rather than mechanism, treat it as interpretation. Now let's walk the actual operation, because it had a structure. The first thing to go was the middle tier, the tacksmen. These were men, often relatives of the chief, who held large blocks of land from him and sublet to the actual working tenants. They were the officer class of the old system, the men who organized the fighting force. Under the new arithmetic, they were a layer of margin between the owner and the ground. So, chiefs took direct control of the land in order to monetize it, cutting the tacksmen out and granting leases instead to incoming sheep farmers who could pay what their own kin could not. The tacksmen who remained responded the way squeezed middlemen always do. They raised their subtenants' rents, sometimes steeply, and many tacksmen, lacking the means to become capitalist farmers themselves, emigrated to America. So the first casualty of the restructuring was the management layer, and it went before the clearances proper began. And notice what removing the tacksman did to the estate's ability to see itself. The tacksman had known every family under him by name, knew which holdings were good and which were failing, knew who could pay and who was ill. That knowledge was not written down anywhere. It lived in a man who had grown up among those families. Replace him with a factor, a professional estate manager, often brought in from outside, frequently a lowlander, paid to deliver a rental figure, and the estate's picture of itself changes completely. What the owner now receives is a set of accounts: acres, rents, arrears. An absentee owner reading a rental in Edinburgh is looking at a document in which the tenants appear only as numbers that are too small. There is no line in it for 400 years of obligation, because there is no way to put that in a column. That is not an excuse for what followed. But it is a mechanism, and it recurs. The moment an owner's only contact with an asset is a set of accounts, the things not in the accounts stop existing. Then came the clearances themselves, and they ran in two distinct phases with different logic. The first phase, from roughly the 1750s to 1815, was not primarily about removing people from the estate. It was about relocating them within it. The landowners were attempting a dual economy. Interior glens converted to sheep and cattle grazing at high rents, and the displaced population moved to the coast, where they would engage in labor-intensive industry. And we have the plan in the factor's own words. Patrick Seller wrote that Lord and Lady Stafford were pleased humanely to order the new arrangement of the country, that the interior should be possessed by Cheviot shepherds, and the people brought down to the coast and placed in lots of less than 3 acres. Lots, he wrote, sufficient for the maintenance of an industrious family, and pinched enough to cause them to turn their attention to the fishing. Read that sentence again, because it is the most honest document in this entire episode. Pinched enough. The smallness of the plot was not an oversight or a cruelty. It was the mechanism. A holding too small to live on is a holding whose occupant must go and work for you. That is a labor policy, written down, by the man executing it. And the industry he expected them to work in was, above all, kelp. Kelp is seaweed, burned to produce alkali used in glass and soap manufacture. During the Napoleonic Wars, it became impossible to import mineral potash from the continent, and the price of kelp went through the roof. Gathering and burning it is enormously labor-intensive, and requires no capital and no skill. So the coastal estates suddenly had a use for a large, cheap, unskilled workforce. And look at what the landlords did in response, because it is the clearest evidence in the whole story that people were being managed as an input. The growth of the kelp industry encouraged landowners to subdivide the crofts further, and to encourage large families. They deliberately increased the population density on the coast, because they were paid by the volume of kelp, and kelp volume was a function of hands. Then the wars ended, and everything failed at once. The continental supply returned, and kelp's brief dominance of the Highland economy collapsed. Prices tumbled. Cattle prices, the other traditional cash crop, fell as well. Returning soldiers added to the population. Now count what the landlord is holding at that moment. A coastal population that has been deliberately multiplied and settled on holdings too small to support them, whose only cash income has just evaporated, who cannot pay rent, and who are legally his tenants. The dual economy has become a single liability, and so the second phase begins, from about 1815 to the 1850s, and its logic is entirely different. This one is not about relocation. Now the landlords were interested only in clearing more land for sheep, which were still profitable, and in some cases even the newly created crofts were cleared. The people who had been moved to make room for sheep were now moved again, off the estate entirely. Sutherland is the case everyone knows, and it is worth being precise. Between 1811 and 1821, as many as 15,000 people were cleared from the Sutherland estates, 1.5 million acres, the largest private landholding in the British Isles, held by the Countess of Sutherland and her husband the Marquis of Stafford. And here is the detail I want you to hold. The estate had been in debt. When her husband inherited a very large fortune in 1803, the estate finally had capital for improvements, and it was after that, not before, that the great clearances ran. They did not happen when the estate was poorest. They happened once it could afford them. This was not a distress sale. It was an investment program. The evictions were executed by factors, Patrick Seller and William Young, and after they were replaced in 1817, the estate continued with even larger clearances in 1818 to 1820. And in the documented cases, homes were burned to prevent tenants returning. That last practice is worth understanding as a piece of estate management rather than as cruelty alone. A roof that still stands is a house that can be reoccupied by a family with nowhere else to go. Burning it converts a reversible eviction into an irreversible one. It is, in the coldest possible terms, asset protection. And the people understood exactly what was happening, early. In 1792, decades before Sutherland, tenant farmers in Strathroysdale organized and drove thousands of sheep off the land in a coordinated action, gathering them and moving them south. It is remembered in Gaelic as the Year of the Sheep. Soldiers were called in. Most of the protesters escaped, and the punishments handed down were light. But look at the target they chose. Not the factor, not the chief, the sheep. They had correctly identified the thing that was replacing them. Now the second trapdoor, and it is the one that catches the landlord. Because clearing the interior for sheep worked, financially, for about a generation. Wool prices held during the wars, and for a time after. But the estate that had cleared its people had also destroyed its own flexibility. The coastal crofting population that remained was destitute and could not pay. Then a potato blight arrived in 1836 and 37, and a far more severe subsistence crisis, the Great Highland Famine, struck in 1846 to 48. At that point, the landlord discovers something inconvenient. A starving population on your land is your problem. You are now spending money on relief for people who produce nothing, having spent the previous 40 years ensuring they had nothing to produce with. So the landlords paid to remove them. Assisted passage. Estates funding emigration to Canada, the United States, and Australia. In some documented cases, a landlord paid to move almost an entire island's tenantry across the Atlantic, and often the tenants were given no real option but to go. Read that as a line item. It was cheaper to buy several hundred people a one-way passage across an ocean than to keep them. And that is the moment the reclassification completes. The population began as the asset that defined the chief's standing. It became a labor input for kelp. It became a cost. And finally, it became a cost worth paying a premium to eliminate. 3 generations, from wealth to expense to disposal. And the legal owner of the land was the lineal descendant of the man whose entire authority had rested on his duty to protect them. And before we run the numbers, there is one feature of this story that separates it from every other business we have looked at. In every other case, the owner and the workforce were strangers. The Venetian investor did not know the man who sailed. The mercenary captain's men chose him, and could unchoose him. Even the medieval lord and his burgesses were counterparties in a written bargain. Here they were the same family. Not metaphorically. The tenants and the chief frequently shared a surname, and the entire moral architecture of the arrangement rested on that. Doothchas was not a lease. It was kinship expressed as land tenure, which meant that when the arithmetic changed, there was no instrument to appeal to. The tenants had no charter, no contract, no written liberties. Historians note the shift precisely. The remaining inhabitants had no security of tenure, now being treated as tenants rather than kinsmen within their ancestral settlements. That is the deepest lesson here, and it is worth stating plainly. The medieval townsman who paid a lump sum for a written charter had descendants still holding the lord to it 600 years later. The Highlanders had something that felt far stronger, actual kinship, and it evaporated the moment it was tested. An unwritten obligation is not a weak contract. It is not a contract. So run the two versions of this business. The version that works, on its own terms. You hold interior glens with decent grazing. You clear them and lease to a capitalized sheep farmer at a rent per acre several times what the townships paid. Your rental income rises sharply and immediately. Your management burden collapses. You are dealing with a handful of tenants instead of hundreds. Your income arrives in cash, on schedule, from men with capital, rather than from subsistence farmers whose payment depends on the harvest. And when wool eventually softens, you convert again to the final and most profitable use of highland land, which is not agriculture at all. Deer forests and sporting estates, led to wealthy men from the south for the season, at rents no farmer could match. That is the modern Highland estate, and it is the endpoint of the whole process. Land whose highest value use is that almost nobody is on it. The version that fails is the one where you are early, or slow, or unlucky in your timing. You borrow against the improvement, clear at the top of the wool market, and find prices falling before the debt is retired. Or you go the kelp route, and are still holding a multiplied coastal population when the price collapses after 1815. Or you clear late, and inherit famine relief obligations for a population you can no longer employ. And a great many of these families did not survive the process they inflicted. They removed the people, took the higher rent, and sold the land anyway, to lowland and English purchasers, who had made their money in industry, and who had no connection to any of it. Which leaves one last irony. Patrick Seller, the factor acquitted in 1816, stayed on the Sutherland estate as a tenant sheep farmer and prospered, ending as one of the largest landowners in the district he had cleared. The employee did better out of it than many of the employers, and there is a final chapter, because the tenants eventually won a piece of this back. Resistance continued through the century, and in 1886, Parliament passed the Crofters Holdings Act. It effectively eliminated future evictions, and it rested on three principles: fair rent, free sale, and fixity of tenure. Look at what those three things are. They are the written, enforceable version of what Doothchas had been informally for centuries: security on the land, and a limit on what could be extracted from the people on it. It took 140 years and an Act of Parliament to restore, in statute, a weaker version of what custom had provided for free, and it arrived after the population it was designed to protect had largely gone. So if you inherit the estate, understand what you have actually been handed. You have not been given land, and you have not been given an income. You have been given a relationship. Thousands of people whose ancestors served yours, on ground your family never bought, and could not have defended without them, and a legal system that has just declared that relationship worthless. The chief's wealth was counted in men, because men were the only thing the Highlands produced that anyone else wanted. The moment the state made men worthless, the arithmetic that had held the glens together for 4 centuries inverted inside a single generation, and the same families that had been the measure of a chief's standing became the largest line of cost on his estate. Get it right by the standards of the ledger, and you own a sporting estate the size of a small county, let by the season, valued precisely because it is empty. Get it wrong, and you burn the roofs off your own tenants' houses, take the higher rent for 20 years, and sell the whole thing to a Manchester cotton merchant anyway.